All right, guys, welcome to Unit 6. In this unit, we're going to call the Gilded Age. We're going to look at the United States in the post-Civil War era. We're going to cover from roughly 1870 to about 1900. So some of this is going to overlap with the last unit that we just did when we were talking about Reconstruction, but we're not going to focus as much on the aspects of Reconstruction that involved African American rights. Those will come up, certainly, when we talk about social issues. But we're going to spend most of our time in this unit talking about the development of the industrial United States. And so you can see this first set of notes here I've titled Creating an Industrial Giant. And so through some of the things you've looked at through your hyperdoc, you've evaluated some of the inventions of the time. You've looked at GDP. In the crash course video, he went through many of the topics that we're going to cover in this unit kind of in an overview. I want to zoom in specifically today and talk about how the United States, or what positioned the United States to be an industrial power during this time period. So remember, we were already a growing industrial power before, specifically in the North, but now in the post-Civil War world, we're going to see that develop even more. So as we kind of get started here, that's where we're going to really kick this off. Following the Civil War, we said that the three goals were to put the Union back together, which we put a check mark on in the last unit. Give freedom to African Americans, which we saw through writing our DBQ had some questionable results. Certainly with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, we had some progress, but ultimately there were still things that were left undone. With Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow and grandfather clauses and poll taxes and all of those things. The KKK certainly left that up in the air a little bit. But then the final thing that we said we didn't really get into, and I told you we would come back to, was rebuilding the South. And part of rebuilding the South is going to be building that in the vision of the North. And that's going to happen a lot because Republicans are going to dominate this period of time, and Republicans are going to be the party of industry. It's a northern party, as we know, and they're going to win the great majority of northern elections during this time period. Of course, in the South, there will be Democratic representatives in Congress, especially once African Americans' voting rights are stripped away. So you're going to see a lot of Democratic governments in the South, but the same thing that really led to the secession of the South in the first place with Lincoln's election, there was very little way for Democrats to win big national elections like the presidency. And in this case, 9 out of the 11 elections during this Gilded Age period were won by Republican presidents. The only Democrat to win will be Grover Cleveland, and he will be president in 2 separate occasions during the Gilded Age. So every other president through this time, from Rutherford Hayes all the way up to William McKinley, will be Republicans. And so under Republican rule, with more representatives that are Republicans, more senators that are Republicans, and the president that is Republicans, there's a lot of things that are going to get passed. Some of these things were passed even before the South was readmitted to the Union, so before Reconstruction even took place, when it was only Republicans really in office. You saw some of these things passed, but what we're going to see are acts like the Homestead Act, which encourage people to move west by giving people free land, which would help kind of shift our agricultural production, opening up more land for industrialization. The Morrill Land Grant Act, which is going to provide land to help build railroads, specifically the Transcontinental Railroad, which we'll definitely talk about in this unit. It'll also help build universities, such as our own Purdue University here in West Lafayette, that allowed for the development of agriculture and engineering. So those things were big. And so all in all, these acts were passed to try to help encourage industrialization. And you can see that it works by looking at a variety of stats. I gave you the real GDP to look at, or GNP to look at. But beyond that, you could also just look at the wealth that was growing in the country. Before the Civil War, there were 400 millionaires in the United States. Within the next 30 years after the Civil War, there's going to go be over 4,000 millionaires in the United States. So certainly a lot of growth. And some of that growth is going to be because there's going to be a big a push for entrepreneurial spirit within this time period. And we'll talk about some of these guys in more detail later. And you guys are going to look at some of these as part of your hyperdoc. But looking at people like Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, the Wright brothers, the development of all of these new technologies and innovations, that's not an accident that happens during this time. And we'll look at that in terms of how the government really helped push this idea by favoring business and following that Republican Northern model as we go forward. But without question, you're going to see the United States emerge as the largest industrial power in the world during this time. You can see really over our history, if you look on this chart, where this blue line here, we hadn't been that relevant. We started to grow in that period right before the Civil War. Around the Civil War, we had a little bit of an explosion as a result of the necessity of fighting war. But you just see that trend continues, and ultimately we're going to overtake Britain here in terms of our manufacturing output. And this, again, is something I referenced on your hyperdoc. It's something that will continue all the way up until 2010, when China will surpass the United States in terms of manufacturing production. So it was well over a century of American dominance in the world of manufacturing and industrialization. So that's an important thing to point out. We'll also see in this unit population shifts, population growth. We've talked about immigration before, but we're going to see much more in the ways of immigration kind of as we go through here. But you're going to see a really large population increase over the course of this period. So again, right at the beginning of the Civil War, there's like 31 million people in the United States. By the time we close out this unit and close out the 19th century, we're going to be talking about 76 million. So more than doubling our population over time, which is important. And so we're going to talk a lot about immigration, specifically in this unit being a big part of why that population grows and really why immigrants are flooding into America during this time. Spoiler alert, it has a lot to do with the fact that there's a lot of jobs available in this new industrial society. We're going to see the view of immigration shift from at the beginning of this period, when there are all these jobs, this idea that everyone's welcome. We're going to come back to this document specifically later on, but you can see Uncle Sam kind of welcoming everyone aboard. A very positive view of immigration, to the point where eventually we're going to get to this view of immigration where it's a little bit more rejecting the idea of immigrants coming in, and we'll talk about like why that happens as we progress through this unit. We're also going to talk about the growth of cities during this time. We'll look at the case study of Chicago. This is what Chicago looked like in 1820. As we progress forward, here's Chicago in 1854. So, before the Civil War, that early industrial growth. But then, Chicago in 1898 looks completely different. And of course, we know Chicago now to be one of the three biggest cities in the United States. So we'll kind of talk about how these cities start to emerge, why they emerge, where they emerge. Why did Chicago, on that little piece of desolate land, turn into one of the biggest cities in the country? So we'll get into stuff like that. We'll talk about the discrepancy between rich and poor in this unit, people living in these enormous palaces, basically, in New York City, versus people living in abject poverty and tenements. So we'll definitely look at the division between classes and what that means. Here's more people just living in very difficult living conditions. This is outside of a tenement. These are more or less outhouses in cities because they did not have indoor plumbing for all of these people. So that's kind of where we're heading over the course of this unit. But we're going to start today by really diving into why industry grows so rapidly. And so as this is the same chart that I put in your hyperdoc, but I wanted to kind of reinforce this. You can just see this steady increase, and especially during this time period, this rapid increase in American gross national product, which is basically the value of all of the things that are produced in the nation during that period. So GNP is an important measure of national wealth, and so you can just see relatively steady growth throughout this entire period, and it's something that will continue throughout the early part of the 20th century, as well as the United States continues to produce. But why is it that this grows? Really, there are 5 reasons that you can point to that we're going to talk about that will allow the United States to be successful. The first one is the idea that we had a lot of technological innovation. I mentioned some of those inventors earlier. You've looked at some of those in your hyperdoc, but we'll look at a few more of those here in just a second. We'll talk about the large workforce that the United States had that made us uniquely positioned to grow our industry so rapidly. Our intense railroad network that spread during this time with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad from sea to shining sea, connecting those big markets in California to the East Coast, which certainly inspired businesses to continue to grow as you are connecting 2 large population areas. We're going to talk about the natural resources of the United States and how those things grew. And then finally, we'll look at government-sponsored capitalism. Capitalism as an idea typically is something that you would not necessarily lump in with the government sponsoring it, but the government kind of stayed out of the way during this time period, which allowed capitalism to flourish and certainly encouraged entrepreneurship to take off. And some of those technological innovations go from just being small ideas to massive industries. So we'll look at all of these things. So let's start with technological innovations. The first one is steel. Steel was not a new technology during this time, but the Bessemer process of producing steel allowed it to be produced faster and cheaper. The big advantage of steel over something like iron is that it's light. During this time period, I just showed you pictures of Chicago a minute ago. You're going to see America's skyline become littered with skyscrapers. Well, steel allows that to happen. So steel is going to be a big part of making America what it is. You know, we don't have necessarily a defining architectural trait in America. And if you look back at great empires of the time, you had the Greeks with their columns and the Romans with their arches. America doesn't really have that defining architectural style, but probably the thing that defines us the most is the skyscraper, and steel will allow that. Also, our railroad system, which I mentioned, is going to be incredibly reliant on steel and producing rails for our locomotives. Also, bridges. The suspension bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge in New York will certainly utilize steel in order to grow. The next biggest thing is oil. Oil is something that will certainly carry us forward into the 20th century as we get into the automotive age. But in this time, you know, it was mostly used for oil lamps and lighting. Eventually, though, as I said, it will become literally the fuel for our cars. And Henry Ford is going to start developing American automobiles during this time period. It's 1920s really when the automobile becomes a prominent feature in America and becomes, you know, part of the American culture. But oil will certainly play a big role in that. Electricity will be developed during this time period. That changes everything. Being able to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is certainly going to help industrialization grow. It's also going to make life better for most people as technology or as electricity makes it to their houses. They will no longer be lighting things with candles, so it's far safer, way less fires. It's also going to be able to allow for refrigeration beyond just a typical ice box, which is going to be certainly good for the agricultural industry and the general, you know, feeding of our society. Having refrigeration, refrigerated cars that can move things like meat from the Midwest into big cities like Chicago, where you'll have the big slaughterhouses. Places like Wisconsin, where you're going to have a lot of slaughterhouses. The railroads and being refrigerated are certainly going to change the game there for cattle farmers. There's also going to be major advances in business. We'll see the development of the telephone, which will replace the telegraph and certainly will connect the world. It'll help allow people to place orders from businesses through like catalogs, like Sears catalog. We'll look at the Sears catalog at some of the items that were available for sale within that. The typewriter certainly makes business writing far more efficient, writing memos and things of that nature. The cash register will certainly allow for quicker transactions. Adding machines, all of these things are going to help revolutionize business from a clerical perspective, which will again make business more efficient and then help it grow. So a lot of good technological innovation that's taking place there. The most famous innovator of this time is Thomas Edison, who people call the Wizard of Menlo Park. But he's going to get credited with a lot of important inventions, probably none more important than the light bulb. And the light bulb, like I said, changes everything, and that it provides opportunities for work. And speaking from just this perspective, which is the growth of business, allows for work to take place throughout the night. You're no longer held to the hours of the sun. You can basically create your own sun and work whenever. So you can create that third shift at night, and more things can be produced. He will also develop the phonograph, which will certainly have an impact on culture in America, as people will start to have like mass culture for the first time, be able to listen to the same music. It's no longer a local thing. The culture will no longer be local. It'll be much more national as a result of things like the phonograph. And then down the road, again in the 1920s, when we have the development of the radio, Edison will also create the motion picture camera, which will have a big impact on culture. Again, people watching the same movies, going to movie houses. That will certainly, at this point, completely silent film. Even as we make our way all the way up to the 1920s, it'll be silent film. But then by the 1930s, we'll be having full sound films. But that's, again, Edison. Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone. I mentioned him, very important. Be hard to undersell the importance of the telephone and how it connected people across the country. Again, you're seeing the country get smaller during this unit because of these technological innovations. People are starting to much more American in that they experience a lot of the same things, and they're able to communicate. And people become more mobile because you can speak to people across the nation. You're no longer tied to the town that you were born in, and a lot of people will see the opportunities to be more mobile with the invention of the telephone, with the development of transcontinental railroads. It's going to make people feel like they have more freedom to move about the country. As Southwest Airlines says, that you're now free to move about the country. Well, that idea was foreign to people during this time period. But now having the ability to not have to get on a horse and a wagon and move around, but to get on a train, which cuts down that voyage. We took on the Oregon Trail in our game. It took months. You can now do that in a matter of days. And that gives people the ability and the confidence to move west even more and spread the country out. The next thing we're going to talk about is the large workforce. I already mentioned that there were a great deal of immigrants flooding into America. You can see in this graph, these pie charts down here at the bottom, that in 1870 there was about 12 million people in the workforce, and most of them, half of them, were in the agricultural field. By 1910, the labor force is going to triple, and you're going to see that while manufacturing didn't necessarily grow that much, agricultural shrunk a lot, which tells you that we're actually being very innovative in the agricultural world as well. Things like the refrigerated car that I mentioned cut down on waste, so you were able to do a lot more. So people shifted to other jobs, and you see commerce makes a big leap here, and then other makes a pretty good leap as well. But that just basically tells you that people are moving into other fields besides farming. People are moving into cities. Immigrants are coming into the country to fill some of these new jobs, and there's less of a focus on needing as many people to farm, and many more people going into business, going into retail, and then going into manufacturing than there had been before. This is a big shift in American life, and a lot of these immigrants are going to be living in relatively poor conditions, which we'll talk about, working really low-paying industrial jobs. But even then, they were incentivized to come here and work those jobs because it was still far better than what they were doing in their home countries, which, again, when we get into the social aspects of this, we'll come back to that. I talked about the railroad network as a big thing that helped grow American industry. The Union Pacific Railroad is the first transcontinental railroad. It'll be completed in 1869. The railroads are generally considered, and I think John Green talks about this in the crash course, as kind of the first big business in the United States. Because in and of itself, building the railroads was incredibly profitable. And if you controlled the railroads, you controlled a lot of wealth. And it became a really disputable fact. When we get into the politics of this time, farmers in the West are going to be, in constant conflict with railroad owners because they feel that they're going to be oppressed in terms of how they're the rates that they're charging to get things to market. And so it becomes a very contentious issue. But the people who are involved in creating these railroads are certainly in line to make a lot of money. There's a lot of investment opportunities in these railroads. And it does, like I said, open the West to the production, a lot of the production that's taking place in the East. So those manufacturers in the East, in places like New York or Chicago, can ship their goods out to those large populations that were moving out west that we talked about prior to the Civil War. It's also going to help, because of that connection to the markets, it's going to aid in the development of those other industries because it's going to, again, connect those markets and give them more people to sell to. And I just put there at the bottom that, it's kind of an interesting fact that, really time hadn't been standardized. People still told time through looking at the sun, or, what might be noon in Lafayette, Indiana, might be like 12:30 in Chicago. There was no real standardization of time, but as more people started to travel rapidly, it forced them to standardize time and create time zones to make sure that railroads were arriving when they were supposed to, and to cut down on accidents between railroads, so kind of knowing where people were going to be. So that's where in 1884, the time zones that we still have, why they were created was to aid with railroad transportation in the United States. There's your railroad map in 1900. So if you can remember back to like when we studied the Civil War, we had a map of railroads, and there were a lot, but not near this many, especially in the South. If you look at the development of railroads in the South, this tells you that industrialization was taking place in the South to a lesser extent. But when you look at the North, it's a mess. You can't even really identify things. But this guy right here, this is that Transcontinental Railroad. That was the big artery that kind of opened things up to California. But then you see later there's going to be a Southern Transcontinental Railroad that's going to go from Los Angeles to New Orleans, and there's going to be other little veins that break off here and hit the major places in the West, helping grow those areas as well. Of all of the things that I mentioned so far, there's one that might be the most important reason why America specifically was able to grow, and it's the abundance of natural resources. A lot of other nations, including Britain, who we surpassed during this time, they lacked something that we had. We had an abundant supply of natural resources. Our nation is enormous. We have water, we have timber, we have coal, we have iron, we have copper, we have oil, we have gold, we have silver, we have really everything that you need in order to be a major industrial power, especially as that West opens up and we encourage more people to go out there. During this time, we're going to find a lot of gold and silver deposits in the West. We already talked about striking gold in the gold rush in 1849, but this is going to become even more. More oil wells are going to be discovered. Steel manufacturing, we have large iron ore deposits in our country, and you're going to see major growth in what we would call, we'll now call the Rust Belt, because you don't see as much of this anymore, but we kind of live like just outside of this major, what was the Iron Belt or the Steel Belt. But up here near Chicago, if you think about driving through like Gary into the south side of Chicago, those places were once enormous factories where steel was being produced. Pittsburgh, obviously known for its steel. You see these deposits here. They're iron ore deposits. Coal mining. Southern Indiana has tons of coal mining. Where there's coal, there's usually oil. So there was oil wells. If you ever drive through Southern Indiana, you see the little oil pumps. Most of them don't work anymore because they've kind of sucked it all dry. But those things are there. You have the timber industry growing. So these natural resources are prominent and are part of the reason why these cities develop where they do. Pittsburgh, Chicago, places like that. Even Lafayette, Indiana, we developed mostly because we're right along a really important railroad artery as people were connecting these areas. And again, Purdue University was kind of founded here because we're right in the middle of this agricultural industrial area where a land-grant university really made sense. So again, you can kind of see coal deposits, and like I said, where there's coal, there's usually oil. So you can see major deposits of oil in our country. And then also here's gold deposits within our country, especially out west, lots of gold. So those ideas, those resources are going to be one of the things that set us apart. What the European powers are going to have to do is they're going to have to go out and find resources. We're getting close to the beginning of World War I. In our next unit, we'll get into basically the world at war. But I'll go ahead and tell you that the reason why everyone goes around and fights wars, World War I and World War II, are more or less fought because everyone else in the world is competing for resources. In both of those world wars, we start out on the sidelines. We start out on the sidelines because we're not as desperate for resources as everyone else. So we don't find ourselves in that competition quite to the level that these other countries like Germany and England and France and Russia, they're going to find themselves constantly looking outside of their country for resources. And they're going to turn to places like Africa. They're going to turn to places like Asia, and it's going to cause conflict within the world. The United States is able to more or less stay above that fray. We're going to get involved in our fair share of imperialism, and we're going to see ourselves extend our borders, but not to the extent that European powers do, where it leads us to be directly involved in World War I. The final major cause for America to industrialize so rapidly during this time is the idea of capitalism. Capitalism is simply the idea that free competition will help grow business. And I mentioned earlier that the government kind of sponsors this, and they sponsor this through basically staying out of the way, with the exception of the protective tariff, where they were taxing foreign goods. The government basically undertakes a policy of laissez-faire economics during this time, which means they don't regulate that much. Now, to some people, they say during this time period, during this Gilded Age, part of the reason why it's gilded is because our industry grows and it's really wealthy, but it becomes too corrupt and the government basically stays out of the way too much. Other people would argue that the government staying out of the way is exactly what America needed in order to grow into this industrial giant. That's a political preference. If you tend to be more pro-business, you're going to be in favor of laissez-faire economics. Regulation, in many cases, will hamper industrial growth, because if you make it more expensive to do business, then a lot of people will avoid business. Now, that said, during this time, there certainly was a lot of issues to work through. And because this was all happening so fast and it was all so new, there is, without question, some corrupt practices that take place here. Where the real debate politically comes in is it the government's job to deal with those issues? Or is it something that if you let capitalistic competition over time, it will solve those problems itself? So if a company is like providing too low of wages, is it possible that another company would come in and provide better wages eventually? Now, in the short term, for those people who are living in terrible living conditions and for really low wages, they would argue without question that the government should be involved. And so wherever you fall in that, that's kind of help laying out what your view of politics are in this new industrialized world. And it's an issue that we still deal with today. What is it that the government should do? Should the government be regulating things by putting a minimum wage in place, or should that be left to the market? That debate that really heats up during this unit, and we're going to see the development of labor unions, and we're going to see workers kind of go to battle against their workers, with the government kind of staying hands off. But this capitalistic idea, because the government was staying out of it, certainly encouraged entrepreneurship. So there are definitely pluses to this. And on top of that, a lot of these entrepreneurs who develop, are people who are going from nothing to incredibly wealthy. When I talk about the growth of millionaires to 4,000 millionaires by 1900, a lot of those people who started out with virtually nothing. We're going to talk about some people like Andrew Carnegie, who grew a steel empire, who started out as a poor Scottish immigrant who had nothing and worked his way up to one of the richest people in the history of the world. So there's certainly something to be said for this, and entrepreneurs are certainly going to be something that it's not unique to America, but American entrepreneurial spirit, something that we call the American dream. If you watch Shark Tank, I mean, certainly as an entrepreneurship teacher, I watch that a lot. But if you watch Shark Tank, you see people who are motivated to start new ideas and who are more motivated to get a patent to protect their idea. Something I had you look at in your HyperDoc. But all of these things developed and created business opportunities and gave people who would have maybe not been able to climb up social classes, and gave them that opportunity. Did it give that opportunity to everyone? You can't say that everyone necessarily took that opportunity, but I think with the idea of capitalism, everyone has that opportunity. It just takes some innovative thought and some really hard work. And I don't want to undersell the hard work that are put in by the laborers who worked in the factories, because they certainly worked hard too for very low wages. But just identifying the fact that those opportunities were there is an important part of what makes American industry different and unique. And the literature of the time really reflects this idea of this rags to riches American dream tale, with people like Horatio Alger, who wrote these books you can see here, that were these, they were all rags to riches stories of, people, whether they were immigrants or people who were born in America, who started out poor and made their way up to incredible wealth. So, like I said, the literature reflects this idea, the spirit of entrepreneurship. All right, I'm going to dive into part 2 real quick, just because I want to go ahead and knock this out in one set of notes. But with the growth of industry, there was also this push for big business. We're going to look at this in an activity in class on Thursday of big business owners, because again, business is going to get a bad rap during this unit, and in some cases rightfully so. As I just said, they were maybe not treating workers the way they should have. A lot of that's the supply and demand. There were so many workers that they felt that they could pay extremely low wages for the work. But when you really understand it at its heart what was going on here, you can kind of see it. Not to say that you can necessarily justify the behavior of business, but you can understand why it happens. So one of the things that happens during this period is the corporations become a big deal. Before this, really in American history, business had been more or less run by families or small groups. What you're going to see now is that investors are going to start pooling their funds and creating corporations, which are standalone entities. They're treated as their own person, which lowers the risk for each individual entrepreneur, and also provides more opportunity for growth. We're going to start seeing the development of the stock market and people investing in businesses in different ways. And so all that's going to really change the landscape of business. It's not all about small family-run businesses kind of in local areas. It's going to be national and eventually international corporations. So if you own a corporation or you're the CEO of a corporation, your goal has to be to make as much money as you possibly can, because ultimately you're responsible to all the shareholders to make sure that they make a profit. So you have to figure out how to maximize that profit to the best of your abilities by setting prices that are reasonable. The thing is, you can't, as a business, control prices. So it says there, how are prices determined? Prices are determined by what people are willing to pay for your product. So basically, supply and demand. So the way you maximize prices or maximize your profit is to gain control of prices, and that's what these corporations tried to do during this time by finding ways to gain some kind of sort of competitive advantage, in some cases by forming monopolies. So if supply and demand ultimately results, as these two lines as they come together create this middle intersection here, dot, which is where price is. If you want to control price, you can either shift your supply. If you reduce your supply, then your price would go up. if you can increase demand, if you can move this line this way, price could go up. But ultimately, you don't necessarily have control of your price. So the way you can do this is by limiting supply or by forcing demand to go up. And so the way they try to do that were by creating certain business organizations that allowed them to limit production, which would keep prices artificially high, kind of game the system. So like a cartel, for example, you probably heard this phrase a lot in terms of drug dealing. It's an agreement to limit production to keep prices high. So it's just a handshake agreement between people. In a lot of cases, this is done like with drugs because different drug dealers want to limit that supply to keep the price high. If it's flooded, if like a certain territory gets flooded with product, then the price goes down, and it really problems in the drug world for sure. You start to see fighting. This happens during the Prohibition era with alcohol. People like Al Capone killing off their rival bootleggers. But it also happened in business, where basically they would agree as a group to limit production. So if we're talking about steel or oil, all the steel companies would basically make an informal agreement to limit production. Sometimes people can backstab you. With a monopoly, you can basically buy up all of your competition or own your competition, so you own everything, and then there's no one that can backstab you. You can just limit production to whatever you want to keep prices artificially high. The other thing that you could do, though, to get around monopolies is you can have the companies merge into a single board of trustees and create something called a trust. This was kind of a way to get around monopolies as government started to regulate monopolies. But you can more or less let the companies continue to exist, but pull them together into a board of trustees, which was kind of a loophole in the system. And trusts were specifically designed to basically be monopolies without being monopolies. And there were really two types of these, vertical and horizontal. If you're a vertical trust, what you basically do is you try to get within your board of trustees, your group, all of the aspects of the business that you need. So if you're going to be a meat industry, you would want to be in control of cattle. You want to be in control of slaughterhouses, railroads, warehouses, the meat packing plants, and the delivery wagons. If you could control all of those aspects, you lower your costs. That's another way you could potentially maximize profits. The other way, the more common way, though, was to be a horizontally integrated company. And that was if you were a U.S. oil company, you would want all of these oil companies to more or less work for you or to join together to form this one company that everyone would be guaranteed a profit, but they wouldn't have necessarily control of their business. And so this is how people like John Rockefeller ended up becoming incredibly wealthy in the world of industrialization. We'll talk more about this as we do our little activity on Thursday. But certainly you can see this was a big deal in American business. A lot of people were merging together either through trusts or monopolies during this time. And you see this big spike right around 1900 before the government really starts to crack down under the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt and starts to regulate industry a lot more. And you see those mergers start to fall by the wayside to some extent. So this is just a quick overview of why the United States grew into an industrial power and how business really got its start. If you have questions about any of this, please ask. As you go through and start working to put together your video responses to the questions, just make sure that you know what you're talking about and ask any questions that you have. I'll talk to you later.